The basement of the Commerce Building in Washington smelled like wet paper for weeks before anyone noticed the smoke. January 1921. A fire broke out in the sub-basement where the 1890 census records were stored. By the time it was contained, a significant portion of the schedules, the individual level forms that recorded the name, age, birthplace, occupation, and household composition of every person enumerated in 1890, were damaged or destroyed. What survived the fire was later destroyed deliberately in a 1933 pulping order authorized by the Census Bureau itself. The government's explanation was straightforward. The records were already damaged, storage space was needed, the remaining schedules had limited research value. That explanation has never been formally disputed. What it has never been is complete. The 1890 census was not an ordinary count. It was the first American census conducted with Herman Hollerith's punch card tabulation system, the mechanical ancestor of the modern computer. It was the first to enumerate Civil War veterans and their widows by name, with pension eligibility attached. It was the first to attempt a systematic count of the populations of newly admitted Western states. And it was conducted at a specific moment in American demographic history, a decade after the largest single wave of immigration the country had ever seen, at the precise point when the question of who counted as American was not merely philosophical. It was also the census that a specific set of people needed, not to exist. Here is what the 1890 census actually contained. The schedules were not a single document. The census of 1890 was conducted across multiple specialized forms: the general population schedule, the Civil War veterans schedule, the mortality schedule, the agriculture schedule, the manufacturing schedule. Each captured a different layer of American life in that year. The general population schedule alone ran to 11 questions per individual, more granular than any previous census, and for the first time included a column for the number of years a person had been married, the number of children born, and the number still living. This was not bureaucratic routine. This was the federal government for the first time attempting to map the interior of American family life at the individual level. The difference between the 1880 census and the 1890 census was not merely 10 years. It was the difference between a count and a portrait. The veteran schedule deserves particular attention. The 1890 Special Schedule of Surviving Soldiers, Sailors, and Marines, to use its full title, enumerated every living Union veteran by name, with their rank, unit, length of service, and any disability resulting from the war. This schedule was not abstract data. It was the documentary backbone of the federal pension system. A veteran's eligibility for a pension and the amount of that pension depended on what the record showed. Widows filing for survivors' benefits depended on what the record showed. In 1890, the federal pension rolls represented one of the largest transfer payments in American government history, and the 1890 Veteran Schedule was the most comprehensive accounting of who was owed what. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters, because the experience of having your legal claim to something depend entirely on a government record, and then having that record cease to exist, is not a condition unique to 1890. It is the operational vulnerability of every person whose rights exist on paper rather than in property. The paper is the right. When the paper goes, the right becomes difficult to prove. For Black veterans of the Civil War, this was not a hypothetical. The United States colored troops, the regiments of Black soldiers who served in the Union Army, were enumerated in the 1890 Veterans Schedule alongside white veterans, their pension claims, their service records, their legal standing as veterans of the United States military. All of it anchored, in part, to what the federal record contained. Archival patterns suggest that pension claim disputes involving Black veterans increased in the years following the loss of the 1890 schedules. Cases where a claimant could not have produced corroborating documentation because the corroborating documentation no longer existed. The record is not explicit on causation. What it shows is a pattern of administrative outcomes consistent with the removal of the evidentiary foundation those claims depended on. If someone in your life has hit a wall, tracing a family member through the 1890 gap, a great-great-grandparent who appears in the 1880 census and then vanishes until 1900, send this to them. The gap is real, it is documented, and there are navigation strategies the indexes don't advertise. The fire itself requires scrutiny. The Commerce Building sub-basement was not an improvised storage site. It was the designated federal records facility for census materials. The 1890 schedules had been stored there since the count was completed. They had survived 30 years of Washington humidity, 2 decades of bureaucratic reorganization, and the physical transfer of the Census Bureau between federal departments. What the record shows about the fire's origin is limited. The official account describes an electrical fault. Historians note that the investigation into the fire's cause was not extensive, the kind of investigation that a private archive or a university library would have conducted after losing materials of equivalent research value was not conducted here. The federal government determined the cause, recorded it briefly, and moved on. What burned first, and what burned most completely, was the general population schedule. The records most directly useful for individual identification, for genealogical research, for legal claims tied to a specific named person at a specific address in a specific year. The veterans' schedule survived. Partially. Fragments exist for some states, primarily states in the South and Midwest. The general population schedule survived for almost no state. This was not an even distribution of loss. The 1933 pulping order is where the record stops being ambiguous. A fire is an accident until proven otherwise. Storage decisions are bureaucratic until the pattern becomes visible, but a pulping order is a decision. It requires authorization. It requires a signature. It requires someone in a position of institutional authority to determine that what remains of a federal record has no sufficient value to justify its preservation, and to put that determination in writing. The 1933 order was issued by the Census Bureau under the authority of the Department of Commerce. It directed that the surviving 1890 census schedules, the fragments that had not burned in 1921, the partially damaged forms that had been sitting in federal storage for 12 years, be pulped, converted to raw paper fiber, rendered permanently unreadable. The order exists. It is in the record. It is not disputed. What the record does not contain is a formal assessment of what was being destroyed. Before a federal archive authorizes the destruction of primary source material, standard archival practice, even by the standards of 1933, called for an inventory of what existed, an evaluation of research value, and a determination that no institution wished to receive the materials as a donation. The National Archives, established in 1934, was 1 year away from existence when the pulping order was issued. Historians note that the timing meant the materials were destroyed before the federal institution whose specific mandate was the preservation of exactly this kind of record came into being. 1 year. The 1890 census schedules were pulped. 1 year before the National Archives opened its doors. This does not prove intent. What it does establish is that the decision to destroy the surviving fragments was made at the precise window when destruction was still administratively straightforward, before the institutional architecture existed that would have made destruction significantly harder to authorize. And then, there's the question of what the 1890 census had actually found. The superintendent of the 1890 census was Robert P. Porter. His published reports, which survived because they were printed documents distributed widely, not manuscript schedules stored in a single basement, contain findings that were politically significant in ways that the decade following 1890 would make increasingly uncomfortable. The 1890 census data showed, in Porter's own published summary, a dramatic increase in the immigrant-born population of American cities. It showed the continued growth of the Black population in southern states, documented by name and household for the first time at this level of granularity. It showed the closing of the western frontier, a finding so significant that historian Frederick Jackson Turner built his entire frontier thesis around Porter's data. And it showed, in the veteran schedule, the full demographic scope of who had actually fought for the Union. By 1933, the political valence of all of that information had shifted. Immigration restriction had been federal law since 1924. The demographic portrait of 1890, the names, the birthplaces, the household compositions of the people who had arrived in the preceding decade, represented a documentary record of exactly the population that subsequent legislation had sought to limit and, in some cases, to remove. The individual level schedules were not aggregate statistics. They were names. They were addresses. They were paper trails connecting living people to documented ancestors whose presence in America predated the restriction era. The record is silent on whether this consideration entered the 1933 authorization discussion. What the archive cannot tell us is what was in the rooms where that decision was made. What it can tell us is what came out of those rooms. A signature, a pulping order, and 62 million individual records, converted to fiber. If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next investigation follows a different paper trail, one where the archive survived and what it contains is more specific than anyone has publicly assembled. The genealogical wound left by the 1890 destruction is not abstract. Every American family that traces its lineage through the period 1880 to 1900 encounters the same gap. A person appears in the 1880 schedules, a name, an age, an address, a household, then silence. Then, in 1900, a different name sometimes, a different address, a different configuration of family. What happened in between? The record cannot say. Because the record that would have said it was pulped in 1933 on the authorization of an agency that had custody of it for 40 years and chose, in the 1 year before a preserving institution came into existence, to destroy what remained. The gap is in every family tree that crosses 1890. It is not an accident of history. It is a decision that history made for us. The 1890 gap is the most well-known hole in American genealogical research. Every professional genealogist knows it. Every ancestry platform flags it. Every family historian who has tried to trace a line through that decade has felt it. The moment when a person who was certainly alive in 1890 who appears on both sides of the gap simply does not exist in the federal record. No schedule, no name, no household, no proof. What is less well known is that the gap was not inevitable. The fire of 1921 damaged materials. Fires happen. But the pulping order of 1933 was not a fire. It was a choice made by people with names, acting under institutional authority in a specific political moment with full knowledge of what they were authorizing. The distinction matters because accidents invite grief, decisions invite questions, and the questions the 1890 destruction invites are not resolved by the passage of time. They become more specific as the research tools improve, because every advance in genealogical methodology, every newly digitized state record, every indexed local directory, every cross-referenced immigration manifest makes the shape of the 1890 absence more visible, not less. The whole gets sharper the more the surrounding record fills in. What surrounds the gap tells its own story. The 1880 census survives in full. The 1900 census survives in full. The decade between them, the decade of the largest immigration wave in American history, the decade of the first systematic count of freed people's households, the decade of the full veterans enumeration, exists only in the published aggregate reports that Robert P. Porter distributed widely enough that no single storage decision could erase them. The names are gone. The households are gone. The individual paper trails that would have connected millions of living Americans to their documented ancestors are gone. What remains is the shape of what was lost. And the shape is specific, enough to ask the question that the official record never formally answered. Not, was the destruction intentional from the start? The fire may have been exactly what the government said it was, but was the decision to destroy what remained in 1933, in the 1 year before the National Archives existed, made with full awareness of what would become impossible to recover once the order was signed? The record cannot answer that. It can only show us the signature and the silence that followed it.